Hey everybody, welcome back to Araya Entertainment for another reaction video. Today we are going to be doing the U.S. Civil War, which is one of my loves. I love the Civil War. I've studied it since I was a kid, and being from Pennsylvania originally growing up, the Civil War was big where we were at. Of course, we had Gettysburg, we had Chambersburg, we had Hanover, which were all battlefields there in Pennsylvania, as well as when I was growing up. Uh, there were tons of veterans from the Civil War buried around in local cemeteries in the small town I was from eastern Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, there was a town called Doylestown that had a old church that had been maybe 200 years old, and in the cemetery, I remember walking around, and there would be headstones like Private so and so killed at the Battle of Seven Pines. So it was really something that resonated with me growing up, as well as my grandparents' house that was made in like 1740, I believe it was. Also had a Civil War veteran that owned it at one time, years before my grandparents did. So without further ado, I'm going to be doing a reaction video to the U.S. Civil War for surprising U.S. soldiers from Extra History. Extra History is one of my favorite YouTube channels. If you want to watch this video without my commentary, go to their channel. We will link it below in the description and check it out. I highly recommend you subscribe to them. They do a phenomenal job with the animation and the storytelling. So let's begin.
Pennsylvania, 1891. A group of Union veterans converged to bury one of their own, Thomas Sylvanas. Sylvanas fought at the battles of Mine Run, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. He was in the color guard when the 81st Pennsylvania charged the breastworks at Cold Harbor. And when the rest of his detail fell, he took the national colors from the hands of a wounded man and carried them the rest of the day.
It's ironic they talk about Pennsylvania. I have not watched this video yet, so we're watching it together. And ironic, Pennsylvania. That's where I was. That's where I'm from, and I have had a number of ancestors that served in Pennsylvania regiments. The 72nd Pennsylvania Regiment was one of the ancestors. George Henshaw was one of my, I think my grandmother's, my mother's side, great grandfather or grandfather, one of those two.
Captured during the siege of Petersburg, he survived starvation and abuse in Andersonville prison, then returned to Pennsylvania after the war to marry and make a home. He became naturalized, voted, and drew his pension like any other old soldier. But the name...
Pensions after the Civil War were crazy. Today we think about like veterans that get a disability pension, maybe they got shot or something happened, but the whole pension system after the American Civil War is it's crazy. You had people running for office that were promising pensions to these veterans just to get into office. There were people collecting pensions that maybe even served just one day during the Civil War. As things got older, there were, further removed from the war, there were old men that were 90 marrying 16-year-old girls so they could collect their pension. As a matter of fact, the last Civil War pension person was a daughter of a Civil War veteran that she just passed away a few years ago. It was 4 or 5 years ago. So they were collecting pensions that long. That's a whole nother video, pensions from the Civil War, but let's keep going.
Name on his gravestone was an adopted title to match his adopted land. In his home country, Thomas Sylvanas was known as Ah Yi Wei, born in Hong Kong on the 4th of July, 1845. When we think of soldiers serving in the U.S. Civil War, we usually conjure up a certain image, one instilled by documentaries, novels, and films. The troops...
Interesting that, when we do think about soldiers in the Civil War, we think of mainly white Anglo-Saxons. There were Jews that obviously served in the Civil War. And then we also think about USCT, which was United States Colored Troops. That's what they were called at the time. There was some Latinos, believe it or not, especially like in places like Texas. But that's what we imagine. And they're either like somebody that grew up on a farm or in a big city like New York. And a lot of immigrants. We picture Irish immigrants or German immigrants joining the Union cause. So this will be interesting where this goes.
Groups we picture are largely white, or in the case of the US colored troops, black. Or on occasion, sometimes we highlight the service of recent European immigrants who came fleeing the instability that followed from the Irish potato famine or revolutions of 1848. But there were also others serving in the army.
It's ironic. I just kind of said the same thing. The white Anglo-Saxon or European immigrant, or the occasional African American.
Of the United States and the rebel Confederacy. People that the wider public is only beginning to learn about, and whose incredible stories historians are beginning to bring to light. And that's important, because in looking at these stories, we get a better picture of America at the time of the Civil War. So today, we're going to do just that. Because while troops like Thomas Sylvanas were rare, they were not unheard of. Research has started to uncover more veterans from Asia and the Pacific Islands, many of which had escaped earlier historical accounts because they enlisted under English names.
I always find it interesting when we talk about Asia in general at this point. There's a lot of people that were out west, like California and Washington, Oregon, that were from China that helped build the railroads. I have read accounts in the past that there were different people of Asian descent in different Union regiments. I've never seen anything about somebody being in a Confederate regiment during the war, but definitely in a Union regiment. I've seen some articles way back 20, 30 years ago that I read about. So this is actually kind of interesting. I'm kind of interested to see what this has to say.
In fact, the National Park Service has begun keeping a list to try to collate and verify their service records. And as of this episode, it has over 300 names. Looking at the U.S. Navy enlistment rolls, you'll see men with birthplaces.
That doesn't surprise me, especially like when he's talking about the Navy. That doesn't surprise me. The U.S. Navy obviously traveled around the world, Europe, the Caribbean, South America, the Far East. So it wouldn't surprise me that they would take enlistments on from other countries. The Army, a little bit different. Generally speaking, the Army in the United States in this time frame really didn't leave the continental United States. I mean, yes, we did go to Mexico. There were some other excursions into Canada prior to the Civil War with different wars and stuff. But the Navy was worldwide. So it doesn't surprise me that you would see foreign recruits from the Navy or the Marine Corps, and they did have a Marine Corps during this time frame.
Places like Bombay, Shanghai, Java, Singapore, Lahore, Manila, Samoa, and Tahiti. Men whose naval captains either hired in foreign ports or lured them away from the whaling industry. But sadly, we know little about these men except for their dates of enlistment and discharge. Those who fought in the infantry, by contrast, gained a certain amount of media attention. Two Chinese infantrymen, Joseph Pierce and John Tomney, fought at Gettysburg. Pierce survived.
I've heard of these two. This was the article that I was talking about earlier about the two people from Asia. I thought they were from China. Something told me they might be from Japan, but definitely from China. Now, the reason that they're saying that the infantry gets a little bit more attention than the Navy, it's because although there was a large naval presence in the Civil War, and the Navy definitely did a lot, the Army being on the ground with the reporters more tends to get a little bit more attention than the Navy. Not to say that the Navy didn't get any attention, but most people can name far more many soldiers than they can sailors from the Civil War. So this doesn't surprise me that this was in the newspapers.
But Tomney, renowned in his unit for humor and personal bravery, died in the peach orchard when cannon shot severed both of his legs. His obituary ran in the New York Times. A few Asians served in the Confederacy as well. A group of Filipinos living near New Orleans enlisted in a Louisiana regiment. And before the war...
That's kind of interesting. You don't really hear much about the Philippines at this time frame as far as the Americans go. It's about 30 years, about 30 years before the Spanish-American War, give or take 35 years, depends on when you're talking about the war. So to have members of the Filipino community join the Confederate Army in Louisiana, but Louisiana, especially New Orleans, was a big mixture of all sorts of people coming. It was a major port, so it doesn't surprise me that there were people that maybe worked on some type of ship that wound up in the from the Philippines in New Orleans. So it doesn't surprise me. I'd never heard of it before. So it's very interesting that Filipinos participated in the American Civil War.
Chang and Ang Bunker, the original Siamese twins, who hailed from present-day Thailand, retired from show business, and bought a plantation in North Carolina. When the South seceded, each had a son join a cavalry regiment. But of all the Pacific nations, the Kingdom of Hawaii sent the most men into combat.
Which doesn't surprise me. The Kingdom of Hawaii, well, it kind of does for this time frame, but Hawaiians have a very big tradition of military service. They're very proud people. I have a lot of respect for the Hawaiians. My father, being in Vietnam, served in the Marine Corps with a number of Hawaiians, and definitely of a warrior class. So it doesn't surprise me. Hawaiians are a very tough people and a very strong people and very warrior-like. And if you're ever in a battle, it doesn't hurt to have some good Hawaiians next to you. They're good people.
Though officially neutral, Hawaii's links with New England whalers and missionaries made it a hotbed for abolitionism. In mock presidential elections, Lincoln polled better in Honolulu than in the US. And when one...
That's interesting because Hawaii today tends to vote a little bit more Democrat than it does Republican. And in those days, even though they weren't part of the United States, they were their own kingdom at that time, they tend to lean a little bit more to the Republican Party, which that's a question in itself, and there's a lot of debate with that because how much more woke do you get than Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves during the Civil War? So it surprises me. It doesn't surprise me. Let's move on.
Southern-born resident dared to fly a Confederate flag. Her neighbors tore it down. Over 100 Hawaiians and Hawaiian-born Americans served in the U.S. Army and Navy during the war, signing up for adventure, money, or to battle slavery. The highest ranking was General Samuel Armstrong, the Hawaiian-born son of New England missionaries who rose to command an African-American regiment. And in the trenches of Petersburg, he was shocked to run into Native Hawaiian soldiers serving as privates with the U.S. colored troops. One soldier had links to the royal family, and some of these men stayed in the army even after the war, joining the infamous African-American Buffalo Soldiers. But
it's interesting that they would join in United States colored troops. It doesn't surprise me because at this time, if you even had like 1/16 of blood in you from any type of African descent, you were considered black. But it surprises me that the Hawaiians would join a all black unit, but kind of doesn't. It's interesting because maybe just the people back then really didn't know what Pacific Islanders were, and they just kind of lumped everybody in together. That's very interesting.
There were others who fought closer to home. March 28th, 1862, Glorieta Pass, New Mexico territory. Two men look down from the top of the mesa, hearing gunfire in the distance. One is the commander of a Colorado unit, but he's been brought here by Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Chavez, whose largely Mexican-American outfit, the 2nd New Mexico Volunteers, know this area well.
Most people don't even realize how big the Civil War was. The Civil War moved all over the United States, and there were battles in Arizona and New Mexico during the American Civil War. Nothing to like there were in the East, like Gettysburg or even Vicksburg, but there definitely was battles out west. And this is where I was kind of talking about a lot of the Hispanic population joined forces out west. It was a little bit more irregular than it was in the East. The further west you got, the less structured the military was, and a lot of times, I want to use the term loosely, less racist than the Army was because of manpower issues. So they would take people with Hispanic or Latina descent.
Many of their families have lived in the area since the 1600s, when the Spanish established missions there. In fact, they'd lived in Mexico where slavery was illegal, until the border moved south after the Mexican-American War. Now they were Americans fighting for the Union. But they know that some of the enemy below them are Mexican-Americans as well. Those who had chosen the other side due to differing beliefs, economic ties to the South, or anger at the U.S. government over the Mexican-American War.
That doesn't surprise me either. If you've ever been to Texas, and shout out to my viewers that are in Texas, have a special place in my heart for Texas. It doesn't surprise me because there's a number of people that are very deep generations in Texas and parts of Oklahoma that are have been in the country a lot longer before it was even the U.S. or even the Texas Republic. So these people are Americans in the sense that they've been there even before the country was formed. So that doesn't surprise me that you would have Latino or Hispanics, or I think they believe they called Tejas, join the Confederate military. As a matter of fact, I know it was pretty prevalent.
At the bottom of the mesa, Chavez sees 200 Confederates guarding a baggage train. Texans who've invaded the New Mexico territory, hoping to seize Union gold mines in Colorado. If that succeeds, they can link Texas with Confederate sympathizers in Southern California.
A lot of people forget, too, that California was around during the Civil War, and even though it was a Union state, there was some Confederate sympathy as you got a little bit further south in the state. But I don't want you to confuse Southern California with the Southern United States. It's just a different mentality, and California being so far away from Washington, D.C. or the East Coast sometimes felt a little bit further removed. So this whole area of down where Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, and California met, the Southwest there, was semi-active during the Civil War, not only by U.S. and Confederate troops, but you also had Native Americans that were participating in battles out there. Colorado is another state where there was, a number of issues with U.S. troops and Native Americans. So this is all going on out west during the Civil War, and is often a forgotten chapter in the American Civil War.
In Pacific ports to break the Union's naval blockade. Chavez doesn't know it, but the Union has already lost this battle, like it has with the last several. With resources stripped for the war in the East, it seems like the U.S. troops can do nothing to stop this Confederate drive across the Southwest, unless they act. The mesa is steep, so they find anything they can tie together: ropes, lariats, saddle harnesses, and they begin to descend the cliff. The Confederates see them and open fire with a cannon. Under a rain of shot, the Union soldiers rope down the steep mesa and form ranks.
If you've ever seen a uniform by somebody who wore in the Civil War, this would really blow your mind. They really didn't have any treads on the bottom of what they called their shoes, their brogans, their gunboats. They didn't have it's a slick sole on the shoe, so it wouldn't be in something they would have even like grooves or hobnails. Maybe some hobnails might have been put in there. And their uniforms are all wool. So just imagine this in the hot desert Southwest, no traction on your shoes or very little traction on your shoes, wearing wool uniforms and having to slide down a mountain. This is crazy.
And once they advance, it's all over. The Confederate baggage train guards scatter. And the main Confederate force, celebrating victory, will return to find their supplies looted and burned, pack mules killed or scattered, and they will have no choice but to walk back to El Paso in the hungry grip of winter. This Mexican-American militia has just broken the Confederate invasion of the Southwest. But Hispanic troops served in more areas than just the Southwest. Up to 20,000 of them served as everything from naval officers to blockade runners, spies to engineers. In fact, when the Confederacy fired on Fort Sumter, it was a Cuban officer, Colonel Ambrosio Jose Gonzalez, who handled much of the artillery. And
let's also remember too that a lot of Hispanics or Latinos from this time frame weren't all Mexican. Some were from Spain itself or Portugal, or maybe some of the islands in the Caribbean, or even Florida that had been a possession. They had their lineage to that. So let's just kind of keep that in mind. It's not everybody was from Mexico that participated in the Civil War. So these numbers don't surprise me. The numbers of the people from Hawaii to 100, I would have never thought it would have been that many. But the Latino numbers definitely don't surprise me, especially with Texas and Louisiana and Florida having a little bit of the tradition from those parts of the world.
In the final clash of the war, conducted after the Confederate government had already fallen, Hispanic Texans served on both sides. When Union sappers blazed a crater in Confederate defenses during the Siege of Petersburg, it was the half-Argentinian mining engineer Henry Pleasants who proposed and managed the operation. At Gettysburg, when Pickett's charge smashed into the Union lines at Cemetery Ridge, a color bearer named Joseph de Castro rushed forward into enemy ranks, battling an enemy color bearer hand to hand. Knocking the man down with his flagpole, he snatched the enemy flag and ran both standards through the swirl of combat, delivering the captured colors to his colonel. For his actions, he became the first Hispanic American to receive the Medal of Honor.
And that is a big to-do. During this time frame, you get a lot of obviously white soldiers and sailors, Marines that get the Medal of Honor, and a number of blacks. But this is not really celebrated today, and this gentleman should be remembered. I mean, Gettysburg was the pivotal battle in the Civil War, by all intents and purposes, the one that, if you know anything about the Civil War, you at least have heard of Gettysburg. And for you to receive the Medal of Honor at Gettysburg is very prestigious. That's on the lines of receiving the Medal of Honor at D-Day or Khe Sanh in in the Vietnam War. Or Fallujah in Iraq. I mean, it's one of the biggest battles of that war, and it's very, it's a lot like that. So this I did not know. So I'm learning right along with you.
In the Navy, 2 Hispanic seamen received the award. One for defending the Union blockade, and the other, a Chilean dispatch runner who was one of only 6 men to breach Confederate defenses during an assault on Fort Fisher. Many men serving in the North.
Fort Fisher is, if you ever get a chance to go down that way, it's the last port that was open to the Confederacy. It gets closed at the end of the American Civil War. And they had been trying, the Union Army, the Union Navy had been trying to take it for a long, long time. And they needed to close this port up. And Fort Fisher falls. There's a very famous picture of, I want to say it was, I think Dale Gallion did it. Was a painting of Navy and Marine forces storming Fort Fisher, and it's pretty big to do at the end of the Civil War, and it essentially closes every port at this point in the southern states. Maybe something might be open in Texas, but as far as the East goes, that's about it.
Were immigrants recently arrived to the U.S., but many Hispanic families who fought on the Confederate side actually predated the Revolution. Hispanic plantation owners living in Florida and Louisiana had settled during the Spanish colonial days, inheriting that empire's own complicated history with slavery.
Just like I said, they had plantations, or they lived in Florida, Louisiana. And we have to keep this in mind, that this is a time when the country was forming. New states were joining all the time. And it's not that far removed to have the Florida territory of the United States become a state. And prior to that, it be belonging to Spain. It's not that uncommon to have people that have lived that long. I mean, there's still people alive today that are not really that old, that were alive when there was 48 states, when Hawaii and Alaska joined the United States. So there are people that remember there were times that states came in. So this is not uncommon that as people lived in certain parts of the country, they became part of the United States and maybe broke away or were sold from various European or colonizing countries.
And due to their social status, they often served as officers. But there were people who had been in the United States even longer, who faced a wrenching choice. Nearly 29,000 Native Americans served in the war, fighting on both sides.
This is actually something that I do know a little bit about. There were units like the 1st Cherokee Mounted Rifles that served in the Confederacy. One of the generals that attended the surrender at Appomattox with Ulysses S. Grant on the staff was a native. There was a number of natives that fought out west. And if I'm not mistaken, Stan Wadey, I believe his name was the last Confederate officer to surrender his command, and he was out west in the Trans-Mississippi West. So the number of Native Americans does not surprise me for the Union or the Confederacy. Yes, these numbers definitely were there.
They were scouts, frontier raiders, sharpshooters, harbor pilots, and crack cavalry. And others served no side, clashing with U.S. Army troops and settlers who abused them and violated agreements. Some tribes that sided with the Confederacy were slaveholders who wanted to maintain their way of life, while others who did the same.
And we tend to forget that in today's world, that natives had slaves as well. And it wasn't until way after the United States freed their slaves that a number of slaves were freed in the Indian nations. So it was very possible to be a slave in, say, the Cherokee Nation or something like that in Oklahoma, and the United States be slaveless, have gotten rid of their slaves months before. So people tend to forget that the natives did have slaves and participated in the slave trade. Not all history is black and white.
Were disillusioned with the U.S. government due to decades of broken treaties. They pledged military aid to the Confederacy in exchange for a better deal. In fact, this tragic choice of which side to fight for divided the Cherokee Nation, with its principal chief John Ross supporting the Union until ousted and replaced by Stand Watie, who led the nation to war for the Confederacy. It became, in effect, a civil war within a civil war.
And you see this a lot with Native American tribes in this area, in this time frame, that there's often civil wars, infighting between Native nations. You see this a lot. That's why when everybody tries to say everything is crisp and clean, and this happened and the natives were displaced, and this painting of a in people's mind that Native Americans were this innocent race of people that had no atrocities to them or didn't wage war on anybody is very wrong. It's very wrong. And this kind of shows a little bit of it. But civil war among tribes was not uncommon, and some of this stuff may even last for years after the Civil War. You just don't know, and a lot of it's probably not even recorded.
But that's a story that deserves its whole own episode. Until then, I'll leave you with this. When Lee and Grant met for the surrender at Appomattox, Lee noticed that the man who drafted the surrender terms was Grant's secretary, the Seneca chief and Lieutenant Colonel Eli Samuel Parker.
And this is who I was talking about earlier. Samuel Parker was at the surrender of Lee and Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. So I had mentioned this a little bit earlier. Samuel Parker was definitely there.
I'm glad to see one real American here, Lee quipped. Parker responded, "We're all Americans."
So tell me what you thought. I thought this video was really good. It's definitely wasn't very in-depth, but did give a little bit of knowledge to things that most people don't know. If you like what you saw, make sure to go over and check these guys out. Extra History. They do a phenomenal job. They've got millions of views. You can't go wrong. Their quality, their research is 100%. And if you like what you saw here, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Share our videos. We're trying to grow our channel. And anything you have, any ideas for future videos or people you'd like us to do a review on, leave it in the comments section below. We'd love to get feedback from our fans and find out what they'd like us to see. Until next time, thanks for watching.